Okay, we said in the last video that Nietzsche thinks that the death of God uh, uh, destroyed and problematized the ultimate why for human beings. Nietzsche wants to investigate into that. That's the diagnosis. That's the problem. God is dead. How do we, well, in order to provide a cure to the diagnosis, provide a treatment to the diagnosis, we need to know how it started to begin with. And so let's look at the idea of God and see what really is behind the idea of God. Well, for Nietzsche, behind everything we already said is power, the will to power. And we said the will to power bifurcates into two perspectives, strong and weak. What kind of perspective of strength or weakness of will to power, what kind of perspective of will to power was behind the idea of God? And moreover, the idea of Western culture. Nietzsche's unearthing the conditions for the possibility, as a hermeneutic, as a hermeneut of suspicion. What were the foundations, the hidden instincts behind Western culture and its morality and its religion? Let's take Western culture and we'll summarize it with Judeo-Christianity, the Judeo-Christian ethic, and the Judeo-Christian God. What's behind that? What form of will to power? Well, it's not strength for Nietzsche. It's weakness. It's weakness. And Nietzsche is basically saying what every atheist sort of intuitively figures out, or I'm not saying atheism is true. I'm not an atheist. But the first time I had an atheistic thought, it was, what if religion was just created by the weak to sort of get control over the world, or to people who feared death? Well, Nietzsche's saying that. God is just an idea that was created by weak people to try to cope. God is a coping mechanism. It's the ultimate coping mechanism from a weak perspective. Okay. But there's something more pernicious behind that. It's not just a coping mechanism. It's not just a coping mechanism for the weak. It's also what Nietzsche calls revenge or resentment. He uses the French term ressentiment because it means to re-feel, re-sentiment, re-feel something. Behind the idea of God, Nietzsche thinks, is not just trying to cope with reality. It's also trying to, in our mind, take an imaginary revenge on our enemies or on the weak people. So he actually thinks that that from the perspective of weakness, remember there's will to power, perspective of strength, perspective of weakness. The weak people just unfortunately outnumber the strong for Nietzsche. And there's a lot more weak people than there are strong people. And there's a lot more losers than there are winners. And the losers have to cope with reality and deal with being oppressed by the strong. And so what do? They come up with this idea of God. And they come up with, out of a perspective of weakness and out of a perspective of hatred, come up with this idea of an imaginary revenge. And they actually create the idea of God as this being that can punish their enemies in another world. They take flight. They deny this world and take flight into another world so that God can punish their enemies and set everything right in the next life, right? And Nietzsche thinks this is the fundamental characteristic of Western culture, what he calls slave morality, okay? Slave morality characterized by resentment, okay? There are two basic kinds of morality for Nietzsche. There's what he calls master morality, the morality of the powerful, the morality of the strong, and then slave morality, the morality of the weak, the morality of the oppressed, the morality of the victims. And that morality, what the fundamental difference between the two is that one is out of weakness, one is a perspective of weakness, one is a perspective of strength. But moreover, when you're in a perspective of weakness, Nietzsche thinks, you feel hate and revenge. So this is an interesting psychological insight he has here. Anytime you hate something, anytime you're resentful, it's because you feel weak. It's because you feel weak. So if you want to know what are the conditions for the possibility behind hatred and weakness, hatred and resentment, it's weakness. When someone feels hatred, it's because they feel threatened. They're in a defensive and ergo weak posture. Masters for Nietzsche, strong people for Nietzsche, don't feel fear or hatred because they don't feel weak. They feel strong. Only out of weakness, the perspective of weakness, do we feel anything like hatred. And Nietzsche thinks, unfortunately, when you're in a perpetual weak position, you're going to feel hatred. And not just hatred for those people with power, but hatred at life. And so you're going to hate this life, and that's precisely what Judeo-Christianity does for Nietzsche. It hates this life and actually denies this world and takes flight into another world. It actually creates what the tradition is called metaphysics, metaphysica, going beyond the physical, going beyond the physical to the metaphysical, the visible world to the invisible world, from earth to heaven. What creates that is hatred for this world out of a weak and slavish perspective. Okay, so to summarize, will to power, there are two perspectives, strength and weakness. Western culture is grounded in the weak perspective and therefore the slavish and therefore the hateful perspective, okay? And he thinks that slave morality, which created values, this is the thing, values are created out of perspectives of power. And out of the weak perspective of power, the values of Western culture came, and those values are steeped in hatred. I'm going to talk more about that in the next video.